The White House releases a new national security strategy document laying out the president's vision for U.S. foreign policy, including a proposed Trump corollary to the famous Monroe Doctrine. Meantime, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth gives a speech at the Reagan Library in California, claiming the mantle of America's 40th president for the current administration's hard-nosed realism.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleague on the editorial page, editorial board member Kate Odell. Late last week, the Trump administration released a national security strategy of the United States of America, a little bit more than 30 pages if listeners want to go take a look for themselves. But Kate, give us a sense of what this document is and what this version of it says, how it might differ from previous iterations.
Well, let me back up and start with why should anybody care about what the national security strategy or listen to a podcast about it or engage with it? Is this just another Beltway document that nobody reads? Well, this is really the most complete picture the Trump administration has given us so far about its thinking on national security in the second term. To answer your question, is it different from past national security strategies? I think it is different from the first Trump national security strategy in 2017, which sketched out this sort of great power competition the United States was facing, the kind of accumulating threats, particularly from the Chinese Communist Party, but also Russia, North Korea, and Iran. This document is also important because it is sort of a window into how different parts of Trump's coalition are competing for the future of what foreign policy will look like after Trump. It will also be deployed kind of within the administration to win tussles over policy and arguments inside the administration. But most importantly, I think it's worth reading and thinking about because our adversaries abroad will read it and they'll use it to understand what debates the United States is having and to take measure of the president. And I think at the very bottom, at the most fundamental level, the thing that this document misses is the big strategic picture, the fundamental threats we should be organizing around, we should be telling Americans about. And that's really the axis among China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. China is the biggest threat to the United States, ferocious nuclear breakout, belligerence in the Pacific. It's also really the singular underwriter of Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine. So we have this food chain of revisionist powers who are working together. They want to displace the United States. It's a global challenge. It's an ideological challenge. And this framework is not represented in this strategy. Strategy wants to set priorities and principles. When do we intervene around the world? And those are important debates, but they really flow down from that larger threat picture. And for all the Trump administration says, we want to bring back some Nixonian realism about the world in the Republican Party. Well, realism starts with the threats to your country's safety and survival. And I think that is what is at bottom missing in this document.
A few of the principles that are laid out here, some of them would probably be no surprise and in line with traditional Republican thinking, and some perhaps more Trumpian. Peace through strength makes an appearance, balanced trade, burden sharing and burden shifting. That is a part where they talk about the new NATO target for NATO allies to spend 5% of their gross domestic product on defense. But to the point, Kate, that you are making about less focus on China and Russia as adversaries, it plays up the Western Hemisphere. Here is a line on the Monroe Doctrine. It says, we will deny non-hemispheric competitors the ability to position forces or other threatening capabilities or to own or control strategically vital assets in our hemisphere. This is the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And Kate, I guess this fits in with the administration's deployment of naval assets to the Caribbean, the strikes on these alleged narco boats, and then the pressure on Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro.
Right. No surprise there. Trump has made clear his emphasis on the Western Hemisphere, his kind of hemispheric view of the world. And I think, the Trump administration has identified migration and an open border that came under the Biden administration as a threat to U.S. national security. But at the same time, the Trump administration is celebrating the fact that it has gotten control of the border. It has reduced encounters quite significantly and has proved that that is a threat that a president actually can choose to manage. And so it doesn't make sense as the biggest threat facing U.S. national security. And I will say, too, the question of this hemispheric strategy also will be immediately tested by what Trump does with that naval flotilla in the Caribbean. We've been deploying just enormous amounts of naval assets, some 25% of our deployed naval ships in that region. But Maduro is still in power. He doesn't seem to be responding to this pressure. So somebody is going to have a climb down in that region. I think that will be the first test of this hemispheric strategy. And again, there are other actors. Russia and China are playing for influence in that region. And so there is removing Maduro would be both in the U.S. interest and would radiate to other parts of the world that to benefit the U.S. But I think that's really the core test of the hemispheric thought.
Kate, as I read this national security strategy document, one of the things that jumps out at me is maybe the challenge, the difficulty of really putting some ideological framework behind what President Trump does, which to me seems like it is often guided by broad instincts. So, for example, here is a paragraph explaining. It says, President Trump's foreign policy is pragmatic without being pragmatist, realistic without being realist, principled without being idealistic, muscular without being hawkish, and restrained without being dovish. It is not grounded in traditional policy ideology. It is motivated above all by what works for America, unquote. And it almost makes me chuckle a little bit about their pragmatist without being pragmatic. It is a challenge if you are trying to put a sort of ideological labels on a set of actions that the president has taken, not wanting to get bogged down in the Middle East, but okay with taking U.S. strikes on the Iranian nuclear program, against regime change operations, except maybe okay with trying to push out Maduro in Venezuela. It is not an easy task, and just as soon as they put this stuff down in writing, President Trump might see an opportunity to do something he thinks is in America's interests that change how it would fit into this framework.
I think the paragraph you read is just a loquacious way of saying that President Trump is ideologically flexible and more than happy to cut his losses when he decides to do so. And I think there is an argument that the strategy itself is not going to constrain Trump, because he's probably not going to read it. And it's belied by other things that he has done in the world, like the Caribbean flotilla and like the strike on the Iranian nuclear program. At the same time, I think it still matters as, like I said, as particularly for showing some of the fissures among the Republican coalition and how they think about national security. There is a competition for what comes next. I think this document really reflects that. I would point out a couple places where it says things that are good and substantive, because it is simply unrealistic, not enough realism about China and Russia and the threats that they face. Same time, the document does include, for instance, it reiterates the U.S. interest for peace in the Taiwan Strait. It says that the U.S. will build a military that is capable of denying aggression anywhere in the first island chain. That's significant of a policy statement, and it at least includes some recognition of that China really is belligerent toward Taiwan and the possibility that they could provoke a crisis there or do a blockade or an amphibious assault is a real one that the U.S. needs to be militarily prepared for. That will require a substantial amount of defense spending. The president has been reluctant so far to dedicate significant resources to national defense, aside from the one big, beautiful bill included a large cash infusion for defense. Now, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth did say over the weekend at the Reagan Defense Forum that the defense budget is going up. And so if that's the case, that is good news. A couple other just quick places where I think it's certainly is better than it could have been. One filter that you have to apply is that President Harris was the alternative. And I think one place where it shows better thinking about the world than Harris had would be on international institutions like the United Nations. I mean, the National Security Strategy basically says we have outsourced too much policy to these multilateral institutions that actively hate America and undermine, and don't appreciate the role of primacy of nations in world events. And I think that is absolutely true. And while Harris and Biden and others on the left, they see more role for values in foreign policy in the world. But what they usually mean by that is progressive values, and they are lectures to other countries on race and identity, and they're way too quick to trust some of these multilateral institutions to bring world peace. So those are at least two places where I think you have to apply that filter and think about the world of alternatives. And that is at least something to be happy about.
Kate mentions Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, one of the policymakers who is tasked with putting this kind of strategy into action around the world. Part of what he said at the Ronald Reagan Library's annual Defense Forum out in California is that we're once again putting American interests first, out with utopian idealism and in with hard-nosed realism. Here is another piece of his speech.
Most who invoke Ronald Reagan's name today, especially self-styled Republican hawks, are not much like Ronald Reagan. The policies they've championed are nothing like his. In fact, for the better part of 30 years, they've been quite the opposite. If you look at actual policies, Donald Trump is the true and rightful heir of Ronald Reagan. It's President Trump who has inherited and restored President Reagan's powerful but focused and realistic approach to national defense.
Kate, I wonder what you made of Hegseth's speech out there. I find myself wondering, did Ronald Reagan not have more than a touch of idealism to him? I mean, remember in 1983, he was urging listeners not to ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding and remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil. The Ronald Reagan that in 1987 said, we believe that freedom and security go together and that the advance of human liberty can only strengthen the cause of world peace. That was right before he said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, was a little bit of an idealistic thing to say.
At a high level, I think this speech is notable because there's a lot of debate on the center right about how much value President Reagan can bring to, and his policy and his grand strategy can bring to the current problems that the United States faces. And a lot of times on the right, you hear now that his blend of economic dynamism, of strong military power, it simply is just irrelevant to the current world moment, that the U.S. is just in decline now. It's simply not strong enough to respond to the world's problems. The coalition that elected Reagan is gone and never coming back. And I think that Hegseth going to the Reagan Library and really trying to anchor the Trump project in Reagan's legacy is a refutation to that analysis. It is a sign that the Trump administration knows who the standard bearer for Republican electoral and strategic success is, and it's Ronald Reagan. So I think that is really quite notable. Now, of course, there are a number of asterisks in the analysis that we could explore. I mean, one of them would be that what you were getting at, which is that Reagan, of course, blended idealism with realism and also saw a large place for U.S. values in the world. And I think it's also, as you note, that Reagan blended idealism with realism. I mean, one thing that Hegseth was talking about was that Reagan took a lot of political risk to negotiate with the Soviet Union, that he talked to communists. But I think the difference is that Reagan, of course, did everything he could to increase his leverage before engaging in those conversations, including that big military buildup in the 1980s, which Hegseth promised is coming, but also just really focusing in on economic dynamism as a source of American power and America's civic foundations. And so, but again, I think the real larger picture, though, is that the Trump administration wants that peace through strength mantle and thinks that Reagan still has something to offer the world and and is appropriate, is worth considering for the current problems.
Kate, you were out in California for that Reagan Defense Forum. What were the vibes there, and how much do you suppose the second Trump era has changed the Republican views of these foreign policy questions? Some notable results from the Reagan National Defense Survey this year that were released as a part of this. 74% of Trump voters saying that it is better for the United States to be more engaged and take the lead in the world rather than less engaged and reacting to events. Overall, do you support or oppose sending U.S. weapons to Ukraine? Trump voters are 60-30 in support of sending weapons. Here's another question. How important is it for the U.S. military to defend Taiwan against Chinese aggression? Only 13% of Trump voters say not very important or not at all. And so there are some, you could read that survey as suggestion that the Trump voters, even Republican voters broadly, are still kind of in the Reaganite mold.
I think that's true. I mean, if you look at that survey, you see that Americans understand what the threats are. And I think that's one reason why the national security strategy is important, because it needs to be able to articulate exactly what the United States is going to do about that threat picture. And it did not exactly accomplish that. We're also waiting on a national defense strategy, which the Pentagon will produce and will kind of inform how the national security strategy is carried out. Where does the United States send its forces? What kind of military does the United States need to deal with its national security challenges? And I think that's going to be another instructive debate, because when you look at the Reagan Foundation survey, when you look at public opinion in other surveys, I think you see that Americans want the U.S. military to be the most powerful in the world, and they want it to be capable of defeating not just one major power in one place, but understand that our enemies get a vote, and that the United States might have to handle more than one crisis at one time. And my concern about this coming national defense strategy is that it might not, or that it won't, build a military that's prepared to fight in two major theaters at once. And Americans hear that and think, oh, well, that's just a huge ask. But the truth is, if there is this access, if there is this growing coordination among the world's hostile powers, and if we do see more belligerence from Beijing and China, we have to take seriously the risk that Russia, for instance, would exploit a Pacific crisis to provoke its own crisis in Europe, and that the United States has to be prepared for that. So I think the biggest question that was on my mind this weekend out in California is, what's the plan in the administration to get our defense forces prepared for that threat? And Hegseth said, like I said, that the defense budget is going up, but we are already 12 months into the Trump administration. The Republicans are about one heartbeat away from losing Congress, and then the midterms may make increased defense spending even more challenging. So the biggest question to my eye is just what, to the extent they'll be able to follow through on that promise of rebuilding the military and preparing it for the larger threats that we face. And while I was out in California, I had a conversation with Roger Zakim of the Reagan Institute, just talking more about that poll in more detail, about how Americans see the world and whether the view that Republicans are all isolationists now is overstated.
And let's take a listen to that conversation now.
Well, let's dig into this public opinion survey that Reagan conducted ahead of this conference, because I think it is interesting in capturing some nuances in how Americans see America's role in the world. So one thing I wanted to start with is 64% of those surveyed said that it's better for America to take the lead in the world and be more engaged. And my takeaway from the poll at the top line is that there are several numbers that support that, nearly 80% saying that it is important to me that America has the most powerful military in the world. In Washington, there's a lot of conversation right now about whether America is taking a step back from the world, whether it should focus on its own domestic problems. So I'm curious if you also see this snapshot as Americans don't really want to pull back from the world and see that the world's problems affect us in the United States.
That's absolutely the big takeaway. Inside the Beltway, there's great talk of isolationism penetrating into the Republican Party through our Reagan survey, both this survey that came out this week, as well as the one we did in June. We have seen that actually with President Trump coming into office, Republicans, especially MAGA Republicans, self-identified MAGA Republicans, increasingly want Americans to lead in the world. In other words, when people thought the Republican Party was going isolationist, that was pretty much happening because those Republicans, specifically MAGA Republicans, were uncomfortable with Joe Biden's leadership in the world. And so if they had a choice between America leading the world under President Biden or America doing less in the world, when Biden was in office, they wanted America to do less in the world. Now, 79% of MAGA Republicans in the survey want America leading the world.
Why don't we jump from there to Ukraine? Because the poll has a couple interesting points about Ukraine. In my own following of public opinion on how do Americans think about Ukraine is that it's very malleable to what's going on and what they're being told by a U.S. president. So back when Biden was president, you did see a sort of Republican frustration in the polls that we were doing too much for Ukraine, that there was no strategy to win the war. But when I look at this survey, you see something north of 40% of those polled are saying, we want Ukraine to help Ukraine defend its sovereign territory. And we prefer that to a deal that trades land, that and doesn't give them a real full security guarantee. So help us think about what's going on, how Americans are thinking about Ukraine as the Trump administration is struggling to get a deal. They're continuing to conduct this diplomacy, but there has not been a breakthrough yet. Americans seem to have a preference for a slightly more, a stronger strategy towards the Ukraine negotiations that maybe we're getting. How do you read the Ukraine results here?
We like to start in the survey, and I think it's particularly relevant as we discuss Russia, Ukraine, is who is the ally, who is the friend, who is the adversary, who is the enemy? And Americans are clear-eyed about this, and we see this time and time again. This survey shows that 79% look at Russia as an enemy. And it shows that 75% of the respondents look at Ukraine as an ally. So we know the American people have a clear-eyed view of who is a good actor here, who is a bad actor here. And I think that ultimately is driving some of the policy questions that you and your colleagues in the Wall Street Journal editorial board are writing about frequently, where you see 64% of those surveyed support sending U.S. weapons to Ukraine. That's a 9-point jump since last year. And so I think you're right, Kate, to say, hey, it was something that Republicans were uncomfortable with when Joe Biden was in office, and it's driven by partisan leadership. But the bottom line is they're comfortable with supporting Ukraine, provided President Trump is in office. That 64% includes 75% of Democrats, 59% of Republicans. Key point here, Kate, is we see that this is robust bipartisan support. So even in this environment, we have great divides between Republicans and Democrats. As it relates to Ukraine, we actually see overwhelming bipartisan support for providing them with U.S. weapons. The other one, which I know you focus on, is Tomahawk cruise missiles, which has taken sort of outsized importance in my judgment, but it's symbolic of whether or not we truly want Ukraine to win, to defeat Russia, regain its territory. Here, 65% of those surveyed would support giving Ukraine or providing Ukraine with these Tomahawk cruise missiles, which would allow a deep strike into Russian territory. That includes 60% of Republicans. So we are clearly seeing both in terms of how Americans view Russia and Ukraine and in the type of support they want to give Ukraine, that they want Ukraine to win.
And while we're in Europe, I think some of the results here on the North Atlantic Treaty Organization are interesting. I mean, one of the values of this survey is that it's conducted every year, and so you can capture kind of how public opinion on some of these topics is shifting. And one thing I really noticed here is that American public support for NATO is up and is at 68%. And now you could certainly tie that to this summer's larger spending commitment that Europeans are going to actually spend 5% of GDP on their militaries. They're going to take their security obligations seriously. So I kind of read this as saying, I think sometimes NATO gets lumped in with other multilateral institutions that center-right Americans don't appreciate. But I think when NATO really is focused on its continental defense and the public sees that, Americans respond by supporting NATO and seeing it as valuable.
I think you're right. And these numbers are the best we've seen yet in terms of support, American support for NATO. We've been doing this survey since 2018. It's a great way to parse between elected officials' particular view, which is what is truly the view of the American people. 68% have a favorable view of the NATO alliance. That's 80% Democrats, 60% of Republicans. And the one that really jumped out to me, I mean, the 68% is great. I mean, that's a supermajority that should reassure our NATO allies in their capitals that the American people are behind them. But we had a question that talked about Article 5 of NATO, which of course is the collective defense, that if Russia were to attack one NATO country, the rest of the alliance would be obligated to defend that country. Again, you would assume perhaps that elements of MAGA would have a problem with Article 5. And what comes out here is that there is 76% support for Article 5. That's just an unbelievable number, getting American people to agree on anything, let alone 76% of collective defense. And, I'm sure you'll get this. We see something similar as it relates to Taiwan. To me, this means, once again, the American people want to be on the side of freedom. They want their military being on the side of the good actor here. And the good actor in Europe is NATO. And they're reassured with President Trump's diplomacy here that NATO is actually acting on their behalf as well with the 5%, as you referenced.
One other topic I wanted to touch too is the public confidence in the United States military. And in previous years out here at the Reagan Defense Forum, we've talked a lot about really lagging confidence in the U.S. military. And you see a recovery in the public opinion poll here that more of the public does have confidence in the U.S. military. I think the Trump administration does deserve credit for making the public confidence in the military a top priority by rooting out diversity and equity and inclusion programs that kind of corroded the public's trust that the military was a meritocracy. So I was wondering if that was one other area you'd talk to, if the military seems to be improving versus other institutions like Congress and whatnot that are reliably in the single digits.
Well, if Congress is the competition, the military and pretty much any other institution is going to win every time. It's a bit of a mixed story. What I think we've seen change and recover, and we've been asking this question since 2018, is Republican trust and confidence in the military. This survey shows that 67% of Republicans have this trust and confidence in the military, but there's a corollary case, and that is now 33% of Democrats share that trust and confidence. And that is because, and we shouldn't be surprised by this, is that the military is often the battleground for a lot of the social debates and divisions in this country. So you have Democratic administrations coming in, and they're advancing their social experimentation on the U.S. military. And now we see this correction with Secretary Hegseth in particular, leading this effort to remove DEI from the military. And so those on the Democratic side are going to be a little bit more suspicious, a little more concerned. This is the outcome of a democratic republic where you have an all-volunteer force and it's elected officials. The commander-in-chief is elected official, and this is the outcome we're going to get.
China in this poll is Americans listed as the greatest threat to the United States. 48% of Americans pick China as the greatest threat to the U.S. in this public opinion survey, up from 21% in 2018. So there has been a real public turn and consensus that the Chinese Communist Party is a threat to the United States. But this is not translating into a tougher stance on China in Washington. And so while we are optimistic that the isolationist trend in the Republican Party is maybe a little bit overstated, I think we also have to confront the fact that the public understands something about China that is not being translated into more hard military power to deter China in the Western Pacific. It's not being translated into, so far, a more hawkish Trump administration on China.
Well, the survey absolutely reinforces what you said. It's very clear that China is the adversary, is the enemy. And it also shows the American people want to be on the side of Taiwan, right? Which, of course, is the flashpoint that matters most in the Indo-Pacific as it relates to the People's Republic of China. 77% say that it's important for the U.S. military to defend Taiwan against aggression. And that's a huge number, including 81% of Republicans. So that's where they want the U.S. military to be. There's another number out there in terms of they would even be supportive of U.S. military coming to the defense of Taiwan. And that's also nearly a supermajority.
Not just for economic reasons. I was struck by the poll really shows that Americans understand that there's something much larger than semiconductors at stake in the first island chain, and that our friendship with Taiwan extends to values and to the geopolitics of the region.
I mean, it's pretty remarkable. 79% would support officially recognizing Taiwan as an independent country. You noted the national security strategy. I was reassured that the Trump administration stood behind strategic ambiguity in terms of not departing from the status quo. Here, Americans are far more hawkish. They want to recognize Taiwan, moving U.S. military assets, including aircraft carriers to the region. 70% support that, up from 58% the last time we asked the question. I mean, it goes on and on in terms of where they want to be. The Trump administration, listen, I mean, there's a big part of President Trump's foreign policy is dollar diplomacy, right? It wants to go ahead and make sure that from a business standpoint, economic standpoint, we're going to get to this $30 trillion economy, and then the decade after that, the $40 trillion economy. And the Trump administration views that China is going to be a ticket there. But at the same time, the flashpoint that matters, the one we're discussing right now, Taiwan, they're not walking away from. And President Trump has made it very clear, including in discussion with the Wall Street Journal editorial board before he was elected that he does not expect President Xi to mess with Taiwan on his watch. And I think that much is quite clear to the leadership in Beijing.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.